Well, with your permission, I would use some slides to explain my points. If we are talking about redrawing of the areas of influence, let me remind you that we have a lot of application by the military power, by great powers and international organizations in recent decades. Actually, 35 operations by European Union were undertaken, and 10 of them with the use of military power during the last 15 years. And NATO, on which you are asking me, NATO enlarged actually 9 times, 9 rounds of enlargement from 12 to 30 states. And right now, Russia feels quite surrounded by the NATO objects and NATO countries. Actually, US presence in Europe reached now 100,000 military. And combined defense budget of NATO states are above $1 trillion US, which are 25 times larger than Russian defense budget. This is why Russia is not even considering to have a war with NATO and trying to avoid it politically as much as we can, the same as NATO. But preventing Ukraine from joining NATO is only instrumental supplementary goal for Russia. Actually, Russia is 146 million people and Ukraine is 41 million, approximately 1/3 of the Russian population. And definitely Russia is not talking about adopting all these 41 million people under the Russian rule, not at all. We are talking about the 2 million people in Crimea, another 2 million approximately in the Donetsk and Lugansk Republic, and about 2 million in Ukrainian-controlled Donbass. On this map, you may see on the right the area which has Russian language as a main language, and on the left in yellow, the area which has Ukrainian language. And these shapes are very similar to the shapes of political voting. On the right side, there are in blue votes for the pro-Russian President Yushchenko, and on the left in orange votes for the President Yanukovych. And actually, if we compare this with the shape of the lands which are taken onto the Russian military control, we see that this shape is approximately the same. And for example, this is a picture from NATO country, from Greece. And it also shows that the lands taken onto the Russian control are only marginal on the eastern Ukraine. And practically, there are 4 directions how the Russia takes under there are 4 directions of argumentation of Russia of its presence in Ukraine. The first is United Nations Charter Article 51, which is self-defense. And the explanation is that 770,000 Russian citizens in Donbass are under constant attacks from Ukrainian army, and almost 1 million of citizens of Ukraine more applied for Russian passports. The second explanation by Moscow is that we do this on request for military assistance according to the Article 5 of Treaties on Cooperation between Russia and Donetsk and Lugansk republics. And finally, Moscow insists that we are preventing for the genocide because more than 15,000 victims of Kiev's massive killings in Donbass there are since 2014. Political goals of the Russian operation could be explained as follows. First, protection of Russian citizens and Russian-speaking population in East Ukraine. Second, demilitarization of Ukraine. Third, denazification, I will explain in a minute. And provide a neutral, non-aligned status of Ukraine for the future. Federalization of Ukraine is also a goal, provide more autonomy for Ukrainian regions. We understand demilitarization not as deprive the other side from any military forces or police, no. We interpret demilitarization as a prohibition to possess certain offensive types of weapons, military objects, and contingents able to set a threat to the Russian Federation. Such elements and contingents, not civilians, are targets in course of the Russian special military operation. Denazification is understood in two elements. First, elimination of openly neo-Nazi nationalist battalions like Azov, Aidar, and others. And secondly, by analogy with the processes in post-World War II Germany, this is a demand to purge away from all levels of power and governance all politicians and functionaries that share neo-Nazi or anti-Russian ideology and conducted respective policies. That would demand new elections, nominations, as well as changes in Ukrainian ideological, information, and educational areas. Finally, assuring a neutral status of Ukraine after the end of special operation means nailing down the international legal level by agreement the responsibility of Ukraine not to enter the NATO alliance and any other alliances of military nature. Exact formula of neutrality for Ukraine is to be agreed in details in written form and balanced by the security guarantees to Ukraine. We understand that. Guarantees to Ukraine from the group of world powers, including Russia, USA, France, UK, Germany, preferably also China, and possibly Turkey. There is an absence of military cooperation treaty between the USA or Germany or Poland from one side and Ukraine from the other side. And this makes presence of their regular troops on Ukrainian territory.
Dr. Nikitin, yes. Now you are talking to us about all the circumstances and the implications of this war, but for the questions that I posed, that Russia feels that it's surrounded by the NATO. However, to prevent joining the NATO was only a tool, and would like to ask Eugene Chawasowski from the USA. Mr. Eugene, many experts have warned that the expansion of the NATO to Ukraine, or even Ukraine seek to join the NATO, will provoke Russia. However, Ukraine leadership have instated that in the constitution. Do you think the Ukrainian leadership have made a mistake? Why they have not foot this attempt to join the NATO to prevent a war?
Yes, thank you very much. So I would say that Zelensky did not actually declare the abandonment of NATO, but rather has said that Ukraine was willing to negotiate neutrality as long as there are security guarantees by external countries, such as the US and UK, mentioned by the previous speaker. But as for it being an error, I think the challenge for Ukraine was that NATO was willing to increase support and integration prospects for Ukraine, but that it wasn't willing to extend actual membership. So this has put Ukraine at odds with Russia for obvious reasons in terms of Ukraine seeking to join NATO, but it's also limited the extent to which NATO could support Ukraine, as we've seen with the US and other NATO countries not willing to get involved directly in the fighting. So I do think that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is very much related to the pursuit of NATO membership by Ukraine, but there are also other motivations and considerations in this, which take on both the geopolitical and strategic consideration.
Now I would like to ask Mr. Niels, the expert of Russian-Ukrainian affairs in Germany. There's an saying that USA have promised the Soviet Union that the NATO will not move an inch toward Eastern Europe. Is that clear? And was that why that did not mention in the agreement that unite Germany?
I want to start by saying thank you, Al Jazeera, for having me. And if I may, I come back to answering your question, but I want to get things straight because Mr. Nikitin was talking about the war. And I want to start off by saying I studied Ukraine for the past 8 years. And I completely disagree with his description and even the data he presented. This data from voting patterns is about 10 to 20 years old. And if you look at voting patterns, I recommend to look at how many people in the East where I worked and which I studied intensively have voted for President Zelensky, and the language barrier that the language divisions that the Russians have created are not a real problem in Ukraine. And secondly, I want to emphasize that this war is an open war of aggression. It's completely illegal, and it's unprovoked. I want to really emphasize this, that from a not just Ukrainian but German and international perspective, the UN, more than 140, I believe, states have condemned this war, and only 5 allies of Russia have supported Russia's stance. So this is very clearly it's very clear where the international community stands on this war, and I'm happy to discuss further details about this. But now to your question, in 1990, there were such talks, and you're talking about the negotiations about the 2+4 agreement. This is about German unification, where Secretary of State Baker and the German Foreign Minister Genscher said basically that the NATO accession or expansion is not in the cards. But you have to see the context and the historical context. So who promised what to whom when? So this is the US government, the Western German government talking with the Soviet government. And in 1990, there was still the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. So the promise at that time, which was codified in an agreement, was only that NATO would not expand its military structures to the 5 new Eastern German states that joined Western Germany in the unification. In the 2+4 agreement and consequential other and following NATO-Russia agreements, there was not, and I have to emphasize this, there was no agreement on further expansions to the east, as in that was not excluded. So I really have to emphasize this, and we can go into the details of the NATO Final Act and later on. But in 1990, such promises were made, maybe by Secretary Baker or Foreign Minister Genscher, but they were not codified in any agreements. So promises made may be broken, but it doesn't matter, because the Soviet Union at that time existed and the Warsaw Pact existed, and it was unthinkable at that time that they would collapse imminently. So you have to evaluate every single of these promises in the historical context.
So there were no agreement in the frame of an agreement with all its legal implication to prevent expansion, although this was not. Now we go to Mr. Nikitin again. Russia, with the countries that Russia attacked 2 countries that not in the NATO. Doesn't that mean that joining this country to the NATO will protect them from Russian attack and make other countries who do not want to join the NATO will rush in order to join the NATO?
First of all, let me remind you that at the beginning of the century, President Putin even discussed with President Clinton and with NATO Secretary General Lord Robertson a possibility for Russia to join NATO. It means that in different decades we had different relations with NATO. At certain stages we were very friendly with NATO. During the 90s, cooperation went quite intensively. Then it was dropped down after the NATO bombings of former Yugoslavia in '99, and then again another rise of cooperation, and then another drop down in the 2008 when Russian-Georgian war happened. But the sources for Russian-Georgian war, as well as for Russian-Ukrainian war, are not directly connected with the NATO itself. NATO is was quite on the margins of the Russian-Georgian conflict. NATO Navy ships were present in the Black Sea, but they didn't intervene during the 5 days of the war. And clearly, NATO now is sending signals that because the Article 5 of the Washington Treaty cannot be applied because Russia didn't invade any NATO country, then NATO can only supply weapons, maybe provide political support, humanitarian support, but not the troops. Not definitely a direct clash with nuclear Russia. And in principle, we understand the position of NATO as cautious, and we are understanding that neither American troops nor NATO troops would show up on Ukrainian territory.
Please continue, Mr. Nikitin.
Yes, actually, we understand that our relations with Ukraine are deeply interconnected with our relations with the West. And practically, some people even say that this crisis is not about directly Russian-Ukrainian relations, but about the general correlation of interests and forces between Russia and the combined West, represented by US, by NATO, and by European Union. Obviously, Russia wants to send a signal that it is returning to the family of global powers, and Russian voice should be heard and taken into consideration when the issues of security in Europe are on the negotiations table. And in general, we want Ukraine to be a friendly neighboring state. After the neo-Nazi groups in the political establishment of this country would be removed from power. But general Ukrainian population should be oriented for the normal peaceful coexistence with Russia, and the main pretensions of Russia deals only with the territory of two regions of Ukraine, the Lugansk and Donetsk, plus Crimea, which was already in 2014 included into the Russian territory. But the rest of Ukraine definitely would stay as a NATO-oriented and European Union-oriented country, which could be accepted by Russia. And say 5 years from now, we may foresee different political scenarios. Among other, kind of split of Ukraine onto 3 different parts. One part which would be Eastern-oriented, which includes Crimea and Donbass. Another part which would be Western-oriented, because many regions near Polish border and many regions near Hungarian border are already considered by Poland and Hungary and Romania as potential lands of their influence. Maybe even some lands could be joining either Polish or Hungarian state. And the central Ukraine would remain as a neutral state between East and the West. And such a neutral state would get the normal political cooperation with Russia. This is how we prefer to see the future.
So with that, such scenario you just have explained, you see that the relationship between Russia and Ukraine has to do with the relationship between Russia and the West, and Russia wanted to send a message to the world that they would like to go back to the international powers family. Mr. Eugene, now the NATO is supporting Ukraine in order to defend itself against the Russian invasion. Is that support temporary, or the NATO will continue its support to Ukraine after the end of the war, so Ukraine will still be able to deter Russia?
Right. So I think that NATO support and aid to Ukraine is very unlikely to be temporary in nature and can definitely be expected to continue after the war. However, I will say that the extent of this support will be dependent on the diplomatic negotiations that are currently underway and the security realities after the war. And here there's 3 really important components to keep in mind when looking into the future. So one is the military status of the war, since that is still going on, although it seems that Russia has been stalled on many of its fronts and may now be reorienting its strategy to focus more on eastern Ukraine rather than capturing all of Ukraine or some of the major cities in which it's faced some very strong resistance in Kiev and Kharkiv and other areas. Related to that will be the global reaction, and especially the reaction from that of the West to Russia's military operations. So we've seen, obviously, the sanctions that have been put into place and other economic restrictions. We've seen diplomatic, political, and economic support for Ukraine only increase from the side of the West. And really, we've seen NATO and EU grow even more in terms of solidarity with one another, when perhaps prior to the war there were some divisions that Russia could exploit, but that seems to be now very unrealistic as a result of this conflict. And then we have to be watching the political status within Russia itself, because we've seen that this war, which is not even being able to call a war within Russia, has sparked some protests and has sparked some dissent. This has been largely locked down on the part of Putin and the Kremlin leadership, but I think there is some cracks there, and that it's not completely unanimous in terms of the support. So basically, the extent of NATO support for Ukraine will depend on how much Russia is willing to compromise. I think the maximalist position that it's had in the negotiations is unlikely to bear fruit. But at the same time, Ukraine has said that it is willing to consider neutrality, but not basically letting go of territory or recognizing Russian control of certain territories. So all of these elements will be very important to watch moving forward in terms of the extent to which NATO will support Ukraine.
Those factors that you just mentioned, Mr. Eugene, what are the forms of the support that will continue to Ukraine even if the war was over?
So that support will come in the form of weaponry. I think that especially as Ukraine has been able to hold its own largely, but a lot of its military assets have been reduced as a result of the conflict. So I think that the US and other NATO countries will certainly keep that form of support going. There's also going to be economic support going to Ukraine, both on a individual country basis, but also within groups like the EU. So these are the kinds of support that will certainly continue, because I don't think that NATO or the EU or US will drop its backing of Ukraine. But again, this does depend on the negotiations that are currently underway and the amount that Russia is actually willing to concede. Because if Russia continues to exhibit its maximalist aims, then I think that the support from NATO that we've currently seen will continue and perhaps even increase. But if Russia is willing to negotiate and be serious in the negotiations, then things like Ukraine's neutral status, even the types of weaponry or the types of secure deployments will be negotiable.
So the support will continue. The volume will be identified later based on a set of factors that will play a critical role in the size of the support provided from the NATO to Ukraine. Mr. Nils, many experts have warned that Russia will not accept the annexation of Ukraine to the NATO. However, the NATO have always talked about the potential of accepting Ukraine. Did the NATO make a mistake, or in order not to
Listen,
provoke Russia?
Yeah, listen, so you have to set this straight. This war is not about NATO. It's not about NATO's membership of Ukraine. NATO membership was not in the cards, and US and Western states like Germany made it clear that they would not welcome Ukraine anytime soon. So this war is definitely not about NATO membership. And in 2008, in fact, Germany and France vetoed NATO membership action plan to Ukraine, and it only got this vague promise of an eventual membership in the near future. And I think it's important to emphasize that NATO accession, again, was not in the cards. So Ukraine chose NATO membership as a strategic goal in its constitution only in 2019. And until 2014, until Russia, in fact, annexed Crimea and stoked the war in the Donbass, Ukraine was a non-bloc status. Had a non-bloc status. So it was essentially choosing between a Western and Eastern policy. It was about multi-vectoral foreign policy. And only Russia's aggression, taking Crimea and the East as a preventive move, basically pushed Ukraine towards the Western direction. So my point is here, if you talk about mistakes of NATO, you have to ask yourself why the countries of the East, of the former Warsaw Pact, did so desperately want to join NATO, because they understood that NATO is the only security guarantee that they have. So if we're not talking about letting Ukraine join the alliance, and I think this was not realistic anytime soon, we have to ask what other guarantees can Ukraine receive so that a war of aggression like we see today will not happen again.
Mr. Matia, you see or you believe that Ukraine joining in NATO will provide a guarantee for it from what could be called ambitious of the Russians in Ukraine?
I think a NATO membership for Ukraine in the near future is very unrealistic given what we saw on the ground. So I think that Ukraine has repeatedly emphasized that it's willing to negotiate about its military neutrality, but not about demilitarization, and they continue to pursue a European integration. So we're speaking of a potential Swedish or Finnish model with a strong Ukrainian armed forces and security guarantees that Russia will not invade the country again.
Now I would like to go to Dr. Nikitin from Moscow. Dr. Nikitin would like to ask you about Ukraine, Georgia before, and Sweden now with their aspiration to join the NATO. However, Russia tried to use force in order to influence the neighboring country. Why the neighboring country of Russia chose willingly to join the NATO and refused to join Russia? And especially taking in consideration the fact that they are fighting not to be aligned with Russia.
Let's don't confuse two different motivations. Russia is interested to provide the rights of Russian minorities in part of Georgia and in the part of Ukraine. Russian minorities and people with the Russian passports, because quite many people of other nationalities received Russian passports both in Georgia and later in Ukraine. And Moscow is, first of all, working with these parts of territory and those part of population which are Moscow-oriented. But we are not interested to get countries which are countries, say Georgia or Ukraine, which are getting constant supply from the NATO side of weaponry, of military assistance in attempt to create them into a kind of anti-Russian-oriented societies and states. And as I said, if NATO would be just assisting in their security irrespective of Russia, in their security in all other aspects, for example, helping in anti-terrorist operations, also helping in with illegal migration, also assisting with getting out of the ways of supply of narcotics, which all are so-called new threats and challenges which are listed in the security concept of NATO, then we are fully agree with NATO. We together with NATO are ready to help both Georgia and Ukraine to become states which are safe, but which are not attacking the Russian minorities, Russian-speaking population, Russian culture, and which are normal neighbors to Russia, not the adversaries to Russia. We don't want to be adversaries neither with Brussels, not with NATO, nor with Ukraine or with Georgia. And if in the future membership in NATO for them would mean not anti-Russian orientation, then this is quite okay with us. And we, in far located future, maybe 10, 15 years from now, we may discuss how we can arrange a security pattern, which would be a return to the old idea of a joint security geometry, joint security system for both Russia, NATO, and the neighboring post-Soviet states.
So Russia believe now Ukraine is a country that is unfriendly with Russia, and they are NATO oriented. So I would like now to move to Mr. Eugene from Washington. Now the two leaderships are negotiating the neutrality of Ukraine. Isn't in the best interest of Ukraine to be a neutral country between Russia and Europe? Isn't that the ideal situation? And maybe Russia would then accept the presence of the NATO to the west border of Ukraine, or do you envisage another scenario?
So I think it can be in Ukraine's interest to be a neutral state, but that very much depends on it having security guarantees against further aggression by Russia. So we've seen basically from 2014 until now that NATO alignment by Ukraine without the prospect, the serious prospect of membership, as the previous speakers have mentioned, has not helped Ukraine ultimately. And in fact, it has been an important factor in the war that is currently underway, albeit not the only factor. Now, whether Russia will accept NATO's presence on Western borders depends on the extent to which Moscow is willing to challenge it, whether that's militarily, which is unlikely against actual NATO members, or in other forms of hybrid warfare, such as cyber attacks or covert operations, things of that nature. But going back to the issue of Ukraine's neutrality, I think it can only be enduring if both NATO and Russia are willing to accept this position and implement an agreement in the diplomatic phase, which we've seen negotiations ongoing, but still the two sides seem to be quite far apart in terms of what they're able to concede. And here I'd just like to end on the point of the geopolitical imperatives that I mentioned earlier. And this is the case for both Ukraine and Russia, and also NATO. Three primary imperatives that are driving, I think, the behavior of all of these players in the conflict. Number one is domestic political and security consolidation, which Ukraine has not been able to achieve because of the conflict within its territory by Russian forces. Number two is protection from neighbors and external powers. And here I think Russia does have some legitimate concerns, not only from Ukraine, but also the NATO support for it. And finally, there's promoting regional and global influence among global actors. So that's happening right now by both Russia and NATO in Ukraine. So as I said, ultimately, Ukraine is being pulled by both of these sides, and ultimately it's Ukrainians themselves that are suffering as a result of it. So really, I think it's important for a real negotiation and a real agreement to be implemented.
Mr. Eugene, let us focus on the neutrality of Ukraine. What would I understand from you that it's unlikely now to achieve the neutrality of Ukraine, and if it happened, it will not sustain. Is that true?
Well, it depends what form the neutrality takes, and especially the security guarantees that would need to be in place in order for Ukraine to agree with it. So Zelensky himself has said that Ukraine is willing to basically drop its NATO membership bid, although that would have to go to a referendum first within Ukraine, but it would very much need to be backed by security guarantees so that if it does make such a move, it needs some guarantees that Russia won't just go in and invade sometime in the future, whether that be in the coming months, years, or even decades. So for neutrality to actually happen, Ukraine's number one imperative that I mentioned earlier, the domestic and political and security consolidation, needs to be in place. And until that happens, then I don't think that Ukraine can accept neutrality, because the fear is that Russia will just continue to go further into Ukraine and perhaps even further into Eastern Europe.
So even this neutrality is not final, and there are so many factors that will play in the neutrality. Neutrality will have an impact on the prolongivity of the neutrality. Now we go to Mr. Mattia from Dusseldorf. Mr. Mattia, several countries former Soviet Union have expressed their intention to use the NATO, like Finland and Sweden. Would this current war will change the policy of the NATO to accept those countries and more?
So just a few days ago, German Chancellor Scholz basically said Finland is of Sweden is they're welcome anytime. So should they decide to join NATO, I certainly don't see any opposition within Europe or the Western Alliance to have them join. But let me make one further argument, because I just cannot let it remain untested, unchallenged. The speaker from Russia said that there is a genocide happening in the Donbass. He said 15,000 victims are dead. I know Eastern Ukraine intimately very well, and my wife's family is from Eastern Ukraine, Russian-speaking. We have a Russian-speaking Jewish president, and who should be removed under the pretext of denazification. If you hear, and I ask your audience, if you hear these claims of genocide, ask where's the evidence. We see now cities in Mariupol, in southeastern Ukraine, half Russian, ethnic Russians there, and primarily Russian speaking, being destroyed, thousands of civilians being killed. So if this is not a genocide, then what is? And you have to ask yourself, if you hear such claims, where is the evidence?
You have responded. Now, Mr. Mattia, let's go back to talk about my question. Your opinion that this current war will change the NATO policy to add more members to the NATO?
It is definitely possible. We saw the NATO summit change its military posture in Eastern Europe, and it's basically the end of the NATO final act. They will double the force presence in the region. And I think it is up to Finland and Sweden, as I said, and you see a clear change in public opinion in Finland. You see a slight change of the public opinion in Sweden. So I think that NATO will accept these two, and I think this war of aggression, unprovoked war of aggression, will permanently change NATO policy towards Russia and towards Eastern Europe, and we will see more permanent forces being stationed near the Russian border, exactly the opposite of what Russia had intended, but it's now provoking with its war of aggression against Ukraine.
Now, Mr. Mattia, we would like, after answering this question, I would like to pose a question to all the three of you. The question is, and I need to answer from each of you, what is the solution now, and what's the most potential scenario? Start with Mr. Nikitin.
Okay, for scenarios, let me project onto the screen two slides with scenarios which I consider realistic. First would be this. there is no plan of elimination of Ukrainian statehood and adoption of its all regions to Russia. Some Western analysts say that this is a plan. No, there is no such a plan. This is not a scenario which Moscow realistically considers. But the second scenario, the split of Ukraine onto several states, is possible. Crimea is already in Russia. Luhansk and Donetsk republics want to become new independent states, and they are already recognized by Russia and even by some other states. Western Ukraine regions, not the big, the whole regions of, say, Lvov or Ivano-Frankovsk, but some parts of them may go to Poland or Hungary, not because of our policy, but because of Polish and Hungarian and Romanian policy. And then the demilitarization neutrality agreement between Russia and remaining smaller central Ukraine could be concluded. But we also have the third possible scenario, the limitation of Russian control to extended Crimea and extended Donbass, and formation of a pro-Russian new independent state, which would have some other name, maybe something like South Russian People's Republic or so, it's not important. But simply, it could be a new independent state on former Ukrainian lands, which would incorporate some districts of other regions of Ukraine, which would like to escape from Ukrainian rule and not to go under the Russian rule, but to remain, as I said, a middle state between Russia and Ukraine. On the remaining part of Ukraine, definitely the main Ukraine, central Ukraine would remain, and it would probably even become a member to NATO and European Union 10, 15 years from now. And probably it would remain adversarial to Russia. But we also have scenario number 4, which is peace or disengagement operations under the United Nations or OSCE mandate. And it's under certain conditions, this could be interesting for both Ukraine and Russia, because we would need a kind of international cool down operation, disengagement operation on the newly established border between areas which are under control of Russia and areas which remain under control of Ukraine. And definitely peacekeepers should be from neutral countries, maybe Bangladesh, maybe India, maybe some Ethiopia. The United Nations has exactly from such countries 8,000 to 10,000 peacekeepers each year. And finally, there could be a scenario of conversion of the whole operation to long-lasting low or mid-intensity conflict, which would remain for decades long. Because already for 30 years, we don't have political solution for Karabakh, and for 50 years, we don't have a solution for crisis between Northern Cyprus and Southern Cyprus, and for 70 years, we don't have a solution for crisis between North Korea and South Korea. So this low mid-intensity conflict lasting for decades, unfortunately, is also one of the possible scenarios. Thank you.
So Dr. Nikitin believe that there is no plan, Russian plan to annex Ukraine, but the scenario is to divide Ukraine. Now, Mr. Chawazevsky, do you agree with this scenario, and what do you think the solution or the end state of this war?
So I have to take a different view from the previous speaker as far as the potential scenarios for the outlook of the conflict. I think the idea of Ukraine splitting into several different states is not a realistic option, at least not from the standpoint of Ukraine itself or of NATO and the West. Perhaps Russia can impose, this breakaway territory strategy that it's had in the Donetsk and Lugansk and other areas such as Abkhazia and South Ossetia throughout the former Soviet states, but a formal split of Ukraine into a southern region or western region, I think that's just something that Russia would like to happen, but is not a realistic option. As far as the scenarios that I see, the primary scenarios for the outlook, the first one is essentially a prolongation of the war in its current stage, a status quo scenario, if you will, but one that military operations are limited to what we've seen take place, and that Russia doesn't make any major further moves onto Ukrainian territory. And we've even said, as I mentioned before, some indications that Russia is abandoning certain positions or at least reorienting its military strategy to focus more on eastern Ukraine in the Donbas region, where it's faced a much heavier resistance than I think it expected in other areas of Ukraine. The second scenario is that, unfortunately, I think it's possible that this conflict can actually escalate. And that depends. I think that both Russia and NATO want to avoid that scenario in terms of the conflict spreading into NATO territory, for example, or beyond the Ukrainian theater. But because of the nature of the conflict and the almost indiscriminate attacks that Russia has engaged in Ukraine, there's always a chance for some kind of miscalculation that does, in fact, bring in NATO countries directly into the conflict. But as I said, I think both Moscow and the West are trying to avoid that. And then finally, the third scenario would be a de-escalation scenario, one that would be underpinned by a political settlement. And I think this is the preferred outcome for all parties involved, but the question is what terms such a settlement would take. So we've seen, as I said, the negotiations take place, but Russia hasn't really indicated a serious position, but just restated its maximalist demands that it's had since the start of the conflict. But I think as the war drags on, and as Russia's military objectives are not met, then perhaps it will be willing to seriously negotiate. And we can talk about things like Ukraine adopting a neutral status. The level of support can be negotiated from the West to Ukraine. But ultimately, this will depend on Russia's willingness to acknowledge Ukraine's right to self-determination and really just stop the conflict in order to really have a more enduring peace than we've seen over the past month and really over the past decade.
So, Mr. Eugene, he doesn't believe that Ukraine will be divided, and this is unrealistic. But he believes that this war will be long, and there could be an escalation. But he doesn't believe that a serious negotiation will put an end for this war. Mr. Mattia, what are the scenarios that you envisage for that war, and how this war is going to end from your point of view?
I tend to agree more with Eugene Chausovsky in the terms that in his scenarios, but I would also add that I think this war will end first and foremost on the battlefield, and then only after Russia fails to achieve its military objectives, there will be a negotiated solutions, and the parameters for this are already defined. The Ukrainian side have said return to the military positions where the Russians were before February 24, before they launched the war of aggression. And then we can talk about the political status questions or in parallel. But I think Ukraine will not accept any loss of territory, at least formally, and will also not accept, officially at least, the annexation of Crimea or Russia's annexation or recognition of the statelets in the Donbas, Luhansk and Donetsk that it itself has created in 2014. So I think the Ukrainians are adamant that they will fight this war because they see it as a war of survival. For them, they will not stop voluntarily. They will stop tooth and nail with everything they have to push the Russians out of the lands that they currently occupy around the capital, around the center of Ukraine, northern, eastern, and southern Ukraine. So I'm afraid that until we see major military losses on the battlefield on both sides, that there will not be a negotiated solution anytime soon.
However, Mr. Mattia said, you said that the war will end at the battlefield. Do you think then this war will take long?
So this is for the military specialists, but what we're hearing from both the US, from Western Germany, from Western Europe and Ukraine is that Russia can and is mobilizing a lot of forces, but it is failing to achieve its military objectives, and they're shifting to allegedly taking the Donbass only now. But the further this war goes on, we're talking about 1 or 2 months, the more clear it will become what the Russians can and cannot achieve. So they are losing the momentum as we speak, and Ukrainians are pushing back. So we can only hope that the war will end in a few months, but there's also a possibility that it drags on even as the more intensive part of it will be reduced. But I think we're talking about a few months that Russia can maintain its current force posture and mobilization while incurring such high losses it receives at the moment.
Now we go to the social media section where we read some of the comments of our social media followers, and then we go back to our guest in order to comment on the comment. We start with Ahmed Khalid, who comments saying that Russia did not achieve its military objective, although Russia control eastern Ukraine and besiege or surround the capital Kiev and target military installations in western Ukraine. Abu Muhammad says that the scenario is as follows. Russia wanted to end the NATO presence in the eastern flank, and if the war continues, it might end with a full-scale war with the NATO. Ruiza says how he is critiquing, saying how Russia did not achieve its goal. They have achieved all the goals they wanted, and this is the end state they wanted. Mustafa says there is no way Russia would use the nuclear power. There is no justification, even if their economy collapsed. They using the nuclear power against the NATO or its NF member will the end of the Russian state and people. Another account, Fofa, says that this is war media rather than a traditional warfare war. So we go back now to our guest to comment on those comments. Mr. Nikitin, how do you comment on what we have heard from our followers on the social media?
Yes. First of all, Russia definitely will not even think about using nuclear weapons and nuclear component in this war. Russian leadership and the Russian military clearly understands that any use of nuclear weapons in the modern world are self-suicidal. And as both American president and Russian president reconfirmed in Geneva some time ago, nuclear war cannot be won and should not be fought. Secondly, as for achieving of military goals, Russian military goals are almost reached because Crimea is under Russian control already for 5 years, practically for 6 years. And the military control over Lugansk and Donetsk regions is almost reached. It would be fully reached within probably several next weeks. After that, Russia may announce that its major military goals are achieved. And the political goals are also more or less achieved because demilitarization of Ukraine happened when more than 3,500 military objects were destroyed on the territory of Ukraine, those which could be threatening to the Russian existence, including the launchers for missiles and far-range artillery and so on. The same could be said about the denazification process because those components of the Ukrainian military forces, which are especially nationalist and Nazi-oriented, like special nationalist battalions, they are almost fully eliminated mechanically and physically in Donbass area, and the other components of the Ukrainian military forces are not dangerous for Russia, and Russia does not plan to deal with them. Many soldiers who were captured as prisoners of war, they already have been released after taking the signatures that they promise not to participate in the military activities in foreseeable future. They are released back to homes, which means that there is difference between Russian attitude toward a couple of national battalions and the other components of Ukrainian military forces, which are not a target. So from this point of view, and neutrality is a potential non-membership in
Mr.
NATO is
Nikitin.
also
It's all clear. It's all clear.
So,
Thank you very much. We move
my
to Mr.
perception
Eugene.
is that both
Mr.
sides
Eugene, we
must
would like your
achieve.
comment on our followers' participation. Please, the floor is yours, Mr. Eugene.
Yeah, so I would take a different position on the issue of Russian military objectives being achieved. So I think that Russia deliberately had vague objectives. So when you talk about demilitarization or denazification, in the beginning of the conflict, there wasn't a very clear messaging on what exactly Russia would consider a success. And I think that Russia has faced, and even Russian officials have commented about this publicly, that Russia has faced more significant resistance in its military operations from Ukraine than it expected. So perhaps what they thought would be a very quick spread throughout Ukraine and capturing Kiev and other major cities in a matter of days or just weeks, well, now the military operations have dragged on for longer than a month, and Russia actually hasn't held any major cities, with the exception of Kherson in the south. So I think that when now Russia is trying to pivot essentially to have a more, I guess you could say, modest or more measured interpretations of what demilitarization means, and especially on this, dubious characterization of denazification. So I would say that clearly Putin is looking for a clear signal to the Russian domestic population, which is really what this is all about, that Russia has achieved some kind of success despite its significant losses. But in terms of the more objective Russian military goals that they had, I think that clearly has been a lack of success on the Russian part and will only be more problematic moving forward.
Thank you. Mr. Matia, we would like also your thoughts on our social media followers' comment.
Yeah, these were good thoughts in part, and I would add to them and respond to them by saying Russia has launched this war of aggression and it has completely lost Ukraine, as President Zelensky was describing in an interview with Russian media. Ukraine is now lost for Russia for generations. So this comes at a very high cost. The amount of war crimes that were committed by Russian forces are incredibly high. So we see Russian-speaking cities leveled by Russian forces, Kharkiv, Mariupol, completely destroyed in the case of Mariupol, carpet-bombed, Russian-speaking, Russian ethnic cities in Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast. These were not military targets. This is a war of annihilation as Ukraine sees it. And this is not what you would do if you want to occupy and win the hearts and minds of those in the areas which you attack. So Russia has in fact lost Ukraine for generations to come, and it will, I believe, pay a high price, not just in physical lives, but also there will come a point in time when it will have to answer for these war crimes in court. I sincerely hope so.
Thank you, Mr. Matia. Now, with that, we reach the end of our second session of our seminar about the Russian-Ukrainian war, redrawing spheres of influence. We would like to thank our guests from Skype, Dr. Alexander Nikitin from Moscow, and would like also to thank from Washington, Mr. Eugene Chawasowski, for being with us. And also we would like to thank our third guest from Düsseldorf, Mr. Mattia Niels. Thank you very much for being with us. Would like also to thank our audience, and we shall meet with you tomorrow at 1300 Mecca time in the